we have today, and then we have next week, which is, what's the date for next week?
The 28th.
Today's the 21st.
Yeah, it'd be the 28th.
Okay, so we have the 28th. We'll do, I did that wrong.
Yeah, you're right.
We'll do John. And then we'll have the 4th of July off. And then we'll have, what is that?
12th.
The 12th.
The 12th, we'll cover Luke. And then we'll have the 19th, I think, off. And then the 26th,
6th.
we'll start the book of Acts. I should have written 5th here instead of 4th. Yeah, the 5th is off. Okay, so we spent a long time on Matthew, and now we're going to cover Mark in one day. So just some basic comparisons between Matthew and Mark, now that you know Matthew pretty well. Matthew was an eyewitness. That's a contrast with Mark. Actually, Matthew and John, as you can see there. But Mark and Luke were not eyewitnesses. But Mark depended heavily on the eyewitness testimony of Peter. So that first blank there is Peter. Mark is by far the shortest gospel. It takes about an hour and a half to read out loud. Mark was intended to be heard rather than read. That was the typical way a work like that would be communicated. You'd send a copy of it to a church, and someone would read it aloud to the congregation. So, what you can have is a neighborhood reading party where you get together with a bunch of snacks and spend about 45 minutes reading the first half of Mark, and then you take a break, have some food, and then read the other half. I've done that, and it's a great experience to do the whole thing. More difficult for a book like Isaiah, but it's really good to get the whole thing in one shot. That was normal in the ancient world. It's harder for us today because of our short attention spans. Number 3, Matthew and Mark are both synoptic gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are all the synoptic gospels. It means they are laid out and very similar. Their work overlaps a lot. It seems like they maybe quote each other. There's a whole, you could read for the rest of your life and you never get done with all the books written about why those 3 gospels are so similar. So there's a lot of overlap, but Mark does emphasize certain themes in his own way. Now, I'm trying to get you to think in terms of themes. I said that last week. When you read the Bible, because it will help you in your normal Bible reading if you, say you pick a book, any book in the Bible, and you read it, and then when you're done, you start it over again, you read it again and again and again, you'll start to notice, hey, let's say you're reading 1 Timothy. You know, this book talks about a certain subject a lot. And so then you go back through and you say, I'm going to underline every time he talks about, say, conflict. And you notice in it, you're like, wow, this is a huge theme in this book. And so you say, that means that God the Holy Spirit wanted this writer to emphasize this theme for a reason. What does he say about that? How can I change my life to fit all the ways he's talking about this subject here? So in yellow, you can see themes. The purpose of themes is so that it helps you notice an emphasis. Number 1, you're reading through the Bible and you notice, hey, he talks about this topic a lot. Sometimes they'll use a key word to help you notice it, a repeated word. And then you can study that theme and say, okay, so there's a lot of different aspects to this theme. And you read every time that writer mentions that theme, you say, oh, he's showing a different side of it, a different aspect of it. So you can notice it, and you can study it, and then you can use it. Now, how can I align the way I live? What can I change about my life to be more in line with the way this writer's emphasizing this theme? And then, once you've done that, it'll help you remember that a lot. So that's a big theme. And I've listed some of the themes here, A, B, C, and D. And what you're saying is going to come up in point D. So number A, letter A, Jesus is the suffering Son of God. That's, under themes, that's one of the themes in Mark. Mark presents Jesus that way. It doesn't mean Matthew doesn't or Luke doesn't, but they emphasize things in their own ways. Mark also emphasizes the uniqueness of Jesus. And another word for that uniqueness is otherness. You'll notice...
So do we put otherness in the space?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You'll notice some writers referring to God as other with a capital O. And the benefit of thinking about God in those terms is that too often we think of God as like us, only all-powerful. But he's not like us. He's more different from us than anything in the universe.
He's spirit and flesh.
Jesus Christ is flesh also. God the Father doesn't have a body. It's important to remember that I'm very different from an animal. I'm very different from a rock. But I'm more different from God because me and the animal and the rock are all part of God's creation. I am a created thing, just like all the stars and everything. God is not a created thing. So it's very important to make that firm distinction in your mind. Otherwise, what will happen is you will trivialize God. Think of God as, I'm doing my thing, God does his thing, I try to talk to him when I can, try to read his word when I can. But we're on the same page. So, yeah. So that's just something that Mark brings out, which is helpful for us. Letter C. Mark invites us to ponder his book by comparing these 5 characters. You have Jesus, his disciples, number 3, his opponents, and Mark brings out a bunch of minor characters. It's a unique feature about Mark. You have these little vignettes of one little person you never hear of anywhere else. They just pop up, they do something. Some woman washes his feet. Some woman pours oil on him. Yeah, and you don't even know her name, but Jesus praises her. And then the last group is the crowds. The crowds form their own group in Mark. So you read the book, if you read it multiple times, you get to know the flow of it, you can start to compare those things. That's one of the... And we'll see one comparison, a comparison between the disciples and a minor character at the end of today. And then letter D, a big theme in Mark is discipleship. Mark focuses hard on Jesus' followers, which brings to light some very practical truths for us today. Mark emphasizes the 12, that's the 12 disciples, the 12's increasing lack of understanding. Jesus calls them to reflect his character. So Jesus is calling his disciples to reflect his character, especially in self-denying. This is the point Natalie was bringing up. Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve others. Self-denying, cross-bearing discipleship. Jesus' disciples must be prepared to face the same kind of rejection and persecution that he faced. So those are 4 major themes in Mark. There are others.
Isn't that interesting that even today Christians face persecution, rejection?
Yeah.
Yes, it is. It's always going to be the case. If they rejected Jesus, they're going to reject Christians. Okay, so let's look at this theme of discipleship through the lens of structure. What do you think I mean by structure? Anyone want to take a guess? When you talk about a book of the...
Solid foundation.
Okay, well, in the case of literature, so a book that's written, it has a different meaning.
Okay. I wouldn't know then.
That's okay.
Maybe chapters.
Okay, yes, you're on the right track. However, the chapter divisions are not original. Mark didn't put in the chapter divisions. They were added later to help us find places.
Of what he was teaching?
Of what Jesus was teaching? That's going to be part of it. Structure refers to the way the book is arranged. So you have this part, and then right after that he adds this story. And Mark has, lots of stories to choose from, but he says, next I'm going to tell this particular story. I'm going to arrange it, right? Just like if you had a bunch of blocks, you would arrange a structure, and another person could arrange them in a different order, same blocks. So, you look at this theme of discipleship through the structure of Mark, the way it's arranged, and there in that box you'll see you have Mark 1 through 8, the first half of the book. Mark is 16 chapters long, is about Jesus' identity. The first half of the book emphasizes who Jesus is. And you see the disciples slowly come to understand that. And then that section ends with the hinge, the turning point in the book, when Peter says, because everyone's talking, who is this guy? Is he John? Is he John the Baptist raised from the dead? Is he somebody else? Who is this Jesus guy? And then Jesus says to the disciples, who do you think I am? And Peter says, you're the Christ. And that's the turning point, because now they know who he is. And the rest of the book focuses on Jesus' mission, what he came to do. So who he is and what he came to do, his identity and his mission. Now, the fact that the disciples don't understand his mission means that they truly, at the deepest level, they don't understand who he is. But they will. Okay, let's look at a more detailed structure. So I just take that box and I just add some details. So 1 through 8 is the identity, which builds to the disciples understanding who he is, and Peter's statement, you are the Christ. And then 8 through 10, which is what we're going to focus on today, is what the section I call, it's the center of the book. It's what I call the education of the disciples. Jesus, more and more in this section, focuses on teaching the 12 instead of all the crowds. And we'll spend a lot of time on those 3 chapters. So what they need to learn, I call it education because what they need to learn is what it means to be the Christ. They know he's the Christ, but what does that mean? And what it means is suffering service. In other words, the cross. Jesus is the suffering servant from the book of Isaiah. He exemplifies this and teaches this over and over again, suffering service. But they don't get that. They think he's going to be a king and he's going to be great and powerful and put down the bad guys, and that's not what he came to do. And so, therefore, if that's what it means for Jesus to be the Christ, what does it mean to be a Christ follower? It means
be a suffering
servant.
servant.
Yes. Yes. We like to be servants, and say, yeah, I helped this person out. But then if they don't act thankful, or if even while we're helping them, they're being rude, we think, well, if they're going to be like that, I'm not going to help them anymore. What if Jesus had acted that way?
He did.
He didn't. He served while he was being murdered. And then the last 5 chapters, 11 through 16, he completes his mission with the cross and the resurrection, which we won't have time to spend on any of that today. Okay, so we're going to focus on 8 through 10, and it is a really unique Markan feature. So that's like, if you something that John does, you say this is a Johannine thing, a Johnish thing. For Mark, you say Markan. So this is a Markan feature. Mark likes to do what some people call Markan sandwiches. Okay? So think about a sandwich. You have 2 buns and a piece of meat in the middle, right? So that's what Mark likes to do. He likes to sandwich one story inside of another story. So he arranges his stories this way to make a point. Here's a fun fact for later. You can use this later, but the center story usually sheds light on the outer story. So I've included these 9 Markan sandwiches in the book of Mark. If you want to look at those later, you can, but let's just look at probably the most famous one in number 3. Jairus pleads with Jesus to save his daughter. Okay. So this would be in chapter 5. This is number 3 on the second page. There's a list of all these sandwiches that Mark does. Number 3 is what we're looking at. So Jairus pleads with Jesus to save his daughter. And then Jesus says, okay. And on the way to Jairus' house, this woman with a blood hemorrhage touches Jesus and gets healed. Remember that story? She just touches his robe, and Jesus says, who touched me? And they're like, what do you mean, who touched you? Everyone's touching you. There's a big crowd. We're pushing our way through a crowd. And then, it comes out. And then that story is done, and then he finishes the Jairus story. He goes to his house and raises his daughter. So there's a story sandwiched in there, and if you compare those 2 stories, you say, wow, Mark clearly, he's using a structure to get us to realize these stories are related. The more I look at it, the little girl was 12 years old. This woman was bleeding for 12 years. Jairus fell at his feet. This woman fell at his feet. You start to see all these similarities. So that is a unique Markan feature. Some of the other gospel writers use it also, but Mark does it a lot. So you can look at those and try to see how the inner story sheds light on the outer story. Later. Let's turn to the last page now. So, could I get someone to read this passage? It's on the screen. If I get someone to read this.
And they brought a blind man to Jesus and implored him to touch him. After spitting on his eyes and laying his hands on him, he asked him, do you see anything? And he looked up and said, I see men, for I see them like trees walking around. Then again he laid his hands on his eyes, and he looked intently, and was restored, and began to see everything clearly.
Okay, what is odd about this healing miracle?
That it had to be, he had to lay his hands on him twice.
Yes, that's right. This last section, he heals his sight. This guy was blind, and now he can see, but he says, I see people like trees walking around. It looks like trees walking around or something.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, does that mean that the first time Jesus failed?
No. I don't think so.
So what?
He did that for a reason.
He did it for a reason. the second time he lays his hands on him, and he can see everything clearly. What do you think the reason could be? Anyone want to make a guess? You can be wrong. That's okay. What do you think?
I think it could be that sometimes healing isn't always instantaneous. I think sometimes it's a progressive or slower thing that may eventually cause you to be healed.
Okay.
And sometimes he can do it.
That's right.
Do it anyway, but
Well,
he
that's
can do it instantly also.
that's definitely true. But
I think it's kind of like when the boy was possessed with the demon that wanted to kill the boy. The disciples could not cast that demon out. Jesus said that the reason that they couldn't was because it takes a different kind. You have to fast, and you have to pray, and you have to get your mind right with the healing. It could be kind of like on that set where demons blinded his eyes.
well, let's do this. Typically, when you have a question, now we could all have a different opinion. I think Mark described it like this, or Jesus did it like this for this reason or that reason. But how do we know who's right?
Yeah.
That's the big question. So when you have a question, the most important thing, the first thing to look at is the context. If you have a question, see the context, because often, especially in Mark, like we talked about his sandwich idea, often the context, what's around the story, will shed some light on it and help you understand the purpose of the story. I mean, it's great that Jesus healed this guy. It's great for him.
I know he took them out of the city because this city was sinful,
Let's-
or they denied Christ.
Let's look at the context and see. Okay, so in the middle here, we have this blind healing, this two-phase healing. And what's on either side of it? What comes before it is a conversation between Jesus and his disciples. And what comes after it is a conversation between Jesus and his disciples. Okay, maybe there's no significance there. Let's look at the content of those conversations and see if that helps us. Marty, could you read? I gave a little excerpt on the screen from the conversation that happens right before the healing.
Okay, do you not yet see or understand? Having eyes, do you not see? And having ears, do you not hear? Do you not yet understand?
They're not paying attention.
Okay, so could that be in any way related to the story that comes right after it? A healing of someone's eyes? They can see, but at first they don't understand what they're seeing, and then...
Okay.
So let's just wait. Let's wait. Maybe there's some connections there, but let's look at what comes after. Okay, so then the conversation afterwards is the disciples finally realize who Jesus is. So let's see. Penny, could you read that verse where they realize who he is?
Who do you say that I am? Peter answered and said to him, You are the Christ.
Okay, so you don't have to say what it is, but is anyone making any connections there?
Yeah.
With the blind two-phase healing. Okay, good. Someone being healed of their blindness is something like what's happening to the disciples. But it's important that we finish the conversation afterwards. Okay? So, before we get to that, what is the similarity between giving sight to the blind and what is happening to the disciples?
The disciples couldn't see who Jesus was.
Right. Yes. Very good. Okay. So then, why two phases? You could have just had him heal a blind guy if you want that miracle to be symbolic of what's happening to the disciples.
Was it his faith?
Well, what happens is right after Peter says, "You're the Christ," and Jesus is like, "Yes," then immediately Jesus teaches about his death.
They looked at Jesus as a prophet up to this point in time, and at the end realized he's the promised Messiah.
Yes, Christ, yeah, that's what Christ means, the Messiah. So they finally realize, "You're the Messiah." And he says, "Yes, and I'm going to die." He goes right into that as soon as they realize who he is. So, let's see. Monica, could you read that little verse at the bottom of the screen there? That's where Jesus starts to teach about his death.
He began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be killed.
So as soon as they realize who he is, you're the Messiah, you're the Christ, and he says, yes, and I need to suffer, and I need to be killed. And does anyone remember how Peter responds to that? Peter just made this great statement, you're the Christ. Yes, he rebuked him. Okay. Sue, could you read what I say, start right where we left off, which was this "and Peter took."
And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but man's."
Okay, so it's very strange. You're like, yes, they finally get it. Oh, wait, they're not getting it. What's going on here? Okay, so what we had is, just recap, Jesus says, having eyes do you not see. Then you have the blind two-face healing. And then you have Peter's realization, you're the Christ. And then you have Peter's satanic mess up. Jesus calls him Satan. That's probably the worst thing Jesus could call you. And he says, don't die, Jesus. So now, what are the similarities between the disciples' new sight and the first phase of the healing?
Well, the dimness or something?
Something like dimness, good. Can anyone flesh that out a little bit?
Blurry.
They don't have the complete reason
Okay,
for Jesus' purpose on earth.
right. Yeah, they know who he is, but they don't know his purpose.
They were looking for a Messiah, the king, not a Messiah who would be killed.
Right. So it's a partial sight now. Oh, you're the Messiah. I get that. And then Jesus says, and guess what? As the Messiah, my job is to come and die. And they're like, oh, no. We get this. We're happy about this. But this other part we don't get. So it's a partial understanding. So this person that Jesus healed, he purposefully did it in 2 stages as an illustration. I mean, I use illustrations, object lessons with people. I wish my object lessons were actually healing people. That would be a cool object lesson. I unfortunately can't do that, but Jesus can. So he uses the healing of this blind man as an object lesson. This is what you're like. Look, you can see now. You know who I am, but you don't know what you're seeing. Now I'll heal him again, and then he'll not only see, but he'll understand fully. So a partial and a full. Okay, so that helps you understand why Jesus did that. It doesn't mean that what you said, Marty, isn't true about healings when you pray for healing, but it means that it's at the very least functioning in multiple ways here. But the big purpose is to demonstrate what's going on with the disciples. And that'll become more clear as we go. So the whole book, as we said before, the first half of the book is about Jesus' identity. The second half is about his mission. And the hinge point is you are the Christ.
Where did you write that down?
Let's see. I don't think there are any... The only blank on the last page so far is, do you still not see or understand? So, now that they know who he is, Jesus must educate them on his mission. So that's the education. So this whole section is about they know who he is now, but they need to learn about his mission. And what happens is, the way we know that Mark intended 8:22 through 10:52, most of 8, 9, and 10, as its own section. It would have been better if whoever divided the chapters would have divided them this way, but they didn't. Is because Mark has left some clues for us. The first most obvious clue is that this section is bookended with the healing of a blind person. We just looked at the first one, a two-phase healing. And then at the end of this section, the end of 10, there's blind Bartimaeus who's healed in one stage. Just boom, completely healed. That is in chapter 10, yeah. But the important thing to note is that in the middle of this section, if you read this for homework, hopefully you notice, man, he keeps talking about how much he's going to die, because 3 times in the middle there, he gives his prediction of his death.
Yes.
Okay? So you notice that's kind of like a sandwich, a triple-decker sandwich, if you will, if you look at the way it's laid out. Okay, so we're going to look at those 3 predictions of his death, and you're going to see what Jesus is trying to teach the disciples, and then at the end we'll look at how good of a job he does of teaching them. So, the first death prediction, he says, I'll be killed. And how do the disciples respond?
We don't want him to be killed.
No. Peter said, no, you're wrong, Jesus. You need to listen to me.
That shows how much they did not understand.
That's right. And then Jesus gives them a teaching. That'll happen every time. He'll predict his death, they'll say something wrong, and then he'll give them a teaching. Okay? The teaching here is this. He says to Peter, you are not setting your mind on God's interests, but man's. We already read that verse. But think about how insightful that is. He doesn't say, Peter, you got it all wrong. I don't know why you got it all wrong, but you did. He says, I know why you got it wrong. Because you're setting your mind on man's interests instead of God's interests. Now, that's going to come into play as we go. Okay. So, how does telling Jesus not to die show that Peter is interested in earthly things more than heavenly things? Roy, I think you alluded to this a minute ago.
Well, they were looking for a conquering king, not a Messiah who died on the cross.
Yes, they were looking for an earthly king.
There's never been a king like Jesus. They were maybe even been thinking he was a step above King David.
Yeah, that's right. And yes, and the Jews, they read the Old Testament and they knew Isaiah talked about a greater David coming, a son of David, but somehow greater than David. They didn't quite understand how that worked because they were really, the older you were, the more respected you were, but they knew there was something like that going on.
Yeah, but there was also in Isaiah, wasn't there a description of how Jesus would die on the cross?
Yeah, they weren't sure like what that was about or who that was, but that probably had to be somebody else because the king wouldn't do that in their minds. They didn't know it was going to be the same person. And it is in separate sections of Isaiah. If you look at Isaiah 40 through, I think, 55, it's all about the suffering person. And then at the end, 56 through 66, it's all about the conquering one. So, which is exactly what Jesus will do. He'll come as the sufferer, and then he'll come as the conqueror. But they didn't see that. They didn't understand that would be the same person.
I think, too, they probably wanted relief. They wanted relief from the sufferings that were under the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they had, yes. And they, of course, their grandparents told them about how the Maccabees had freed them from their foreign overlords, and they had all that in the back of their minds. But we can't get into all that. But the basic thing is we wanted an earthly king, and that's what they say after the first. Yeah, you're right. They wanted to be rescued from Rome. Peter wanted to be rescued from Rome instead of from his sins. That shows that his mind is on man's interest, not God's interest. God's interest was saving us from our sins. We think that God's interests are about our comfort and our suffering. And it doesn't mean God doesn't care about that, but it means he cares about other things far more. I have a close friend who's suffering unjustly. And I'm praying that it will get resolved and everything will be okay for him. But I'm also praying and thanking God that he's going through this. Because it's easy for me to say, right? But I can see from the outside that this is exactly what he needs. I can already see spiritual fruit in his life from this suffering.
Yeah, every time you go through a trial, it's a growing period.
Yes. I tried to tell him that. Probably wasn't the best move on my part. But
He'll understand it later.
I think he will when he looks back on his life. It's really hard to see from within.
Yeah. Right now he's in the forest.
Yes, but the point is that's how God operates. Is that God is more interested in our holiness than in our happiness. So, what we had the first prediction of being killed. I'll be killed. Peter says no. And the teaching is you're not setting your mind on God's interest, but on man's. So it's about this physical versus the spiritual. And so Jesus continues to teach. That's why this little section that I read Sunday morning for the reading said, if you save your life, you lose it, but whoever loses his life will save it. That's obviously a purposeful paradox. It sounds contradictory, but it's not. And then Jesus goes on to say, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?
Right.
For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? So, the earthly versus the spiritual. So, here's the structure again. The two blind healings bookend it. The 3 death predictions in the middle. And after the first death prediction, the disciples essentially say, we want an earthly king. And Jesus is explaining, that's not what you're supposed to want. Educating them. Okay, let's look at the second death prediction. Similar structure, set up the same way, but different things. Okay. Penny, could you read this little verse from chapter 9?
They will kill him, but they did not understand this statement, and they were afraid to ask him.
So they still don't get it. And then, this is the sad part, they have a conversation amongst themselves, the disciples, about who is the greatest. Peter's probably saying, I'm probably going to be the greatest because I'm always the leader. I'm the leader of our group. I'm the most outspoken. I don't know what they were saying, but they were talking about who was going to be the greatest. And then Jesus gives them a teaching. Okay, and this is what he says. Monica, could you read 9:35?
If anyone wants to be first, he shall be last of all and servant of all.
And then, does anyone remember he uses a person as an object lesson for this? Does anyone remember? What person does he?
Bartimaeus?
No, not yet. That's coming. He gets a child.
Oh, yeah.
Sets him down. Did you see this child? Now, this was in a time when children were not like, oh, it's a child. Don't do anything to hurt or upset a child. If a child's crying, they need to be comforted. Back then, if a child's crying, maybe if you hit him, he'll stop crying. And he'll learn not to cry like that. I'm just saying it was much different culture.
Even in our days,
Yeah, I know.
children were not coddled.
I know. We live, sadly, in an age of extreme coddling. But regardless of that, children were low
On the totem pole.
on the totem pole. Yeah, yes. If you were a kid and there was, I mean, that's the way it was even in the 80s, If there was a lack of a bed, I knew I was the youngest in the family. I knew I was sleeping on the floor. That's just the way it was.
And you know what? It made you stronger, right?
Yes, I hope so. But whether or not it did, that's what happened. And it was even more extreme in ancient times. So he said, you need to be like this. Someone no one respects. The first will be last and the last will be first. You want to be...
we put like child in there?
Let's see. Well, no, we're not quite there yet. Sorry. So here it is. The first death prediction, they say we want an earthly king. The second death prediction, they say we want to be great. And he's teaching them, no, you want to be a servant. That's what I'm here to do. That's what you need to be here to do. But they still don't get it. That concept of greatness is the reason why in this section there's an emphasis on the scribes and the Pharisees, who thought they were really great and righteous, and the rich man who thought he was really great because he was powerful and important and rich. And obviously, if you're rich, that means God is blessing you. And he would cite verses, from the Old Testament that made it sound like God does bless. God gives money to righteous people. There's verses that say that. They would take those out of context and say, since I'm rich, I must be great. God must love me. So there's an emphasis on scribes and Pharisees, the rich man, and on children in that section. Okay, but we're moving on to the third death prediction. So in chapter 10, coming to the end of the education section, Jesus says, I am going to be killed. And James and John say, Marty, could you read what James and John say? 10:37.
Grant that we may sit one on your right and one on your left in your glory.
In your glory. Okay. So.
That's after he's raised from the dead.
Well, that's what they mean. Well, they don't know he's going to be raised from the dead. He's like, he's talking about dying again. That's not, hey, regardless, can we sit on your right and left hand? These two brothers come to him. Now, at least they want something spiritual over something physical. So that's a step in the right direction. But what's the problem with their request? Anyone see it?
Still focused on themselves.
Yes.
What did you say?
They're still focused on themselves. They're still seeking their own honor. So Jesus gives them another teaching. And in this teaching, Natalie, could you read this verse here, 10:43?
Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant.
Okay, and then, again, Natalie, the next verse, I omitted 44. Then this verse says,
For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many.
It says, whoever wants to be great needs to be your servant. Even I, the most important person who's ever lived, even I came to serve others, to give my life.
It's hard for them to understand.
Yes, it was very hard. So, the whole structure is, he says, I'll be killed, we want an earthly king. I'll be killed, we want to be great. Who's great? I'll be killed, we want honor. And then we come to the final blind healing of blind Bartimaeus. So, earthly, great, and honor. Yes, it was very hard for them to understand. Everything was upside down and backwards.
Because they're looking for an earthly king. They can't understand. Well, why is he going to be killed? What does that have to do with us?
Yes, and they said, we want to sit on your right and your left hand in your glory. We'll come back to that later. Okay, so we get to blind Bartimaeus, the end of this section. In contrast to the disciples' desire for status, they wanted to be great, they wanted to have honor. It wasn't enough that they would just sit at the table. They wanted to be at his right and left hand when he was in his glory. They wanted glory for themselves. Bartimaeus recognizes his need for mercy. He says, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. What does mercy mean? Anyone know?
Compassion.
Not getting what we deserve.
It's something that they don't deserve.
Yeah, it has to do with what you deserve. Grace is getting something good you don't deserve. Mercy is not getting something bad you do deserve. Right? If you're merciful, you don't,
You don't sue.
you don't sue, or you don't
Spank me.
you don't spank the child when they deserve it.
So you wonder, what did Bartimaeus know so that Jesus was so special that he kept calling out, Jesus, Son of David?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say what he knew, but here's what he does know. He sees, obviously he's blind so he doesn't physically see, but he sees, he understands what the disciples do not see. He sees that we deserve nothing from God. Now, how could this guy who hasn't been Jesus' disciple, I mean, he can't travel around, all he can do is sit and beg.
Yeah, I know.
There was no, in the ancient world, if you had a disability, you were done. It wasn't like, oh, well, you only have one hand? Well, we can find a job for you that you only need one hand. It was like, you only have one hand, get out of here. Why would I pay you when I could pay someone with two hands who can do more work than you?
So where was he getting his information about Jesus?
Well, we don't know, but that's a good question. There's a clue, and that is the fact that he was blind, and that means in that culture that all you could do was a beggar. All you could do was be a beggar. It's the only way you could survive as a blind person. Sight is the sense of doing tasks. If you can't see, you can't do tasks. And in doing tasks is what earns you money and gets you respect and honor. You honor someone because they did something great, right? Hearing is the sense of communication. You can talk to people. If I was blind right now, we could still be talking. Everything would be the same because we're communicating. So, his despised position in his society helped him see that. Think about his life there. All these people, they can see, they feel like they're better than him. Were they better than him?
No.
Did they do anything great to be able to see and that he should have done and didn't do? It's your own fault, you're blind. No. And think about what that would teach you. Is that everyone despises me. I'm the worst person in the whole town. But nobody else is any better.
About liking people, not liking people, and insight into, you can be observing so much.
Yeah, in a different way.
Emotions, what's happening.
Yeah, you'd be hearing people's conversations and you'll say, they're not any better. They all feel like they're better, but they're not. They didn't do anything to deserve that. We don't deserve anything. So, blind Bartimaeus could see what the disciples didn't see, is that we deserve nothing from God. Okay, so Jesus heals him. One stage, boom, totally healed. That ends the section on the education of the disciples. So the blanks there are Bartimaeus asked for mercy, the disciples asked for status.
Status?
Status, yeah. You could say honor or greatness, whatever. Okay, so did the disciples' education work? Jesus takes this whole section teaching them about his mission. I'm going to die, then I'm going to rise. This is what's going to happen. Okay, well, we're going to find out. Well, we're going to find out if it worked because Jesus, in his greatest hour of need, takes the three closest to the disciple, which is Peter, James, and John. He takes them to the garden and he says, watch, which means something like be on the alert. And then he goes just, 50 feet away, a stone's cast. He falls down and prays his deep, emotional prayer. And he comes back, and what are the disciples doing? Sleeping. And he says, could you not keep watch for 1 hour? You say you're devoting your lives to me, but you couldn't do this for 1 hour? Now, I'm going to take a little brief side note here from the teaching, and now this is going to turn into preaching just for a minute. I'm sorry, I apologize. But people who think they're going to do some great thing for God, if I ever had to give my life for God, I would. If I ever had to, but they won't do the small thing. They won't humble themselves and admit they're wrong to a person in their life. Then they would not do the big thing. They think they would, but they won't. If you can't do the little thing for God, what makes you think you'd ever do a big thing for God? Okay, so, did the disciples' education work? Let's see. When he's going to get arrested. Let's see. Marty, could you read this verse?
Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they were saying the same thing also.
And they all were saying the same thing also. So Peter gets the most, bad press on this denying him and saying, I won't deny you, and then denying him. Even if I have to die with you. Well, if you couldn't stay awake for an hour, you couldn't give up your sleep, something tells me you're not going to give up your life. But he didn't know that. Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same thing. All 11 of them, because Judas is gone at this point. Then, 19 verses later, Marty, you read.
Even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. And they all were saying the same thing also. And they all left him and fled.
They all left him and fled. So, did the disciples' education work? Let's look at one more passage. Sue, could you read this from chapter 15?
They crucified him. The inscription of the charge against him read, the King of the Jews. They crucified 2 robbers with him, one on his right and one on his left.
When was the last time in Mark there was something said about being on the right hand and the left hand of Jesus?
That was when they were asking to be seated on his right hand.
Yeah. When you're in your glory, we want to be on your right hand, on your left. Well, where is James now?
Watching Jesus die.
No, he's not. He's gone.
He left them.
Now, in their mind, they liked Jesus' glory when he's getting honored and having a banquet, a celebration banquet. He liked that kind of honor, that kind of glory. They said, when you're in your glory. But in one sense, this moment was the greatest moment of Jesus' glory.
Yeah.
When he was doing the greatest deed ever done.
For us.
And there were people on his right and his left hand. But it wasn't James and John.
They fled.
So, did the disciples' education work? I ask again. So far, it doesn't look like it did. Let's look at one more. Monica, can you read this?
Yes. She went and reported to those who had been with him while they were mourning and weeping when they heard that he was alive and had been seen by her.
Okay, and then Debbie, I'm going to add one more line, the next line.
They refused to believe it.
They refused to believe it. So, this is what Jesus has been telling them. I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to rise. I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to rise. I'm going to be killed, and then I'm going to rise. And they refused to believe it when they heard it, that it had happened. So did the education of the disciples work? The grade, I think they earned, is a big fat F. So, then why the second blind healing? Sorry. If the first one showed that they had partial knowledge, and then he goes through the education, and the end is the healing in one stage, it seems like if Jesus is using the blind healing symbolically, which clearly he is of the first one, it seems like maybe the second one would symbolize that they finally get it. So why the second blind healing? Well, someday Peter would die for Jesus. He did in the end. And someday James would also die for Jesus. In the end, he did. God used them in spite of their failure. This is the very bottom of the last page. Perhaps they needed to fail so that it wasn't about their greatness, but about God's.
That makes sense.
So, that gives you a little overview of the book of Mark and some of how Mark's emphases differ from Matthew's.